Good afternoon and welcome to this next session, which is our session on the Industrial Revolution. And as you can see, we've got two fantastic speakers with us online. And we also have one with us at the moment, which is Charlie, who is doing more old school, which is right next to me. But we'll come on to that in a minute as to why that happened. But first of all, I'll do a quick introduction. Perhaps Paul and Andy, sorry, Andy, you could just turn off your cameras for a second and I'll do the introductions. There we go. Brilliant. Okay, great. So welcome to this session. As I say, it's the Industrial Revolution. And let's just look at the subject matter. The data, logistics and industrial sectors continue to grow and expand, but our local plans are not always integrated, and last mile delivery and the changing approach to logistics are not always satisfied. What needs to be done to improve the situation? And also just a quick look at the data center market. And this will particularly be looking at across the Thames Valley and Arc regions. So what I want to do is also just show on the right hand side, if you just before we start, we've got a chat function, which you can Jim is there as ever. He seems to be our first on every session. Well done, Jim. And anybody else, please put your questions in there, and we will try and answer them as much as possible. And you can do some hyperlinks with it or put your name down or whatever. But please do introduce that user as a sort of chat room. That's fine. Second, we've got to go poll, and automatically we've got a question there. What's the biggest issue facing the industrial logistics and data center market? I was always danger of putting something like other there, but because people use it. But there we go. But that's starting to fill out. Please do click on that. It's very, very helpful to get your feedback. And we've got 3 other polls coming as well throughout the event. So. Let's get into the topic at hand. The ubiquitous shed or boxes or industrial market are now part of everybody's discussion, and you can see them on the vernacular everywhere by the motorways or at key logistical points. The market is supposedly booming, with increasing land values getting ever higher and rents also following that trend. Maybe this is all part of a further trend for customers to look at a new way of shopping at home or maybe on every device which you can use, such as the mobile phone. But is this growth recognised by local plans? And this is a really important point. And is it part of the government's thinking, especially as planning reforms start to be considered by the government? So what I'm going to do now is ask the speakers in no particular order. Paul, do you want to just come back online? Are you there? Yeah, Paul, great. So Paul Lewis is the Regional Director, Thames Valley and Data Centres at SEGRO. Perhaps you just want to explain what your role is there, and also maybe just highlight what's the big issue for you.
Hi, afternoon everyone. As Matthew said, I'm Regional Director for Thames Valley at SEGRO. Is one hat I wear, and the second hat is I'm head of their European Data Centre group. And I suppose the period that we've all been in over lockdown and post it has just been really, really busy from a market demand point of view. We're seeing a lot of demand. But clearly also on the other side, we're having to work with our customers as they go through the pandemic and the lockdown, and we've seen different impacts on different client sectors. So it's been a really busy time for us. Top that all off with a sort of 700,000 square foot development programme currently at the Slough Trading Estate. So keeping that on track's kept us busy as well.
And that's quite interesting. Just a quick question. You're finding the market still fairly busy for you? Yeah. Demand has not dropped off?
No, surprisingly gone the other way, actually. I mean, during lockdown, we let our 60,000 square foot speculative shed at Bracknell, which fully leased up that scheme. And then at the Slough Trading Estate, where we've got a mix of units, what we actually saw was an increase in demand. So in that sort of May to July period, when we were in the midst of the lockdown, inquiries were actually up about 76% over that period. And actually what we saw was quite a lot of interest, particularly from the SME sector. And what you'd previously seen in downturns was that SME sector was the first one to sort of start to slide away. But actually we saw an increase in demand from those small unit customers. And I think since March, we've led about 17 units on the trading estate.
Right. Okay. Fascinating. Really interesting. We'll explore some of that again. So, Paul, if you could turn off your camera, and maybe now we could have Andy. Andy, great. Thanks for doing that. So, Andy Jansen, Managing Director of Jansen's. Perhaps you could just explain your role and what Jansen's do for those who don't know, and obviously what's your big interest in industrial market?
Yeah, for those of you that know me will remember me also from my agency days when I had my practice, Jansen's and Partners. We were based out of Uxbridge, but quite Thames Valley orientated, and we're involved in millions of square feet of existing industrial warehousing accommodation. But also a lot of new builds as well. So, the industrial market is really sort of close to my heart and where we sort of did a lot of business. Current business, Jansen's Property, or full title, Jansen's West London and Thames Valley Limited, sort of speaks for itself. So 17 years in now, based out of Beaconsfield, very much a Thames Valley focus. Out of 38 projects, 26 in the Thames Valley. Across a lot of mixed uses, so we tend to follow the markets where we can see exits, whether that's residential, whether it's industrial, or more recently, care is very strong as well. Student housing still doing pretty well, even though the hiatus that we've had. And answering your question, actually, what's our biggest challenge? Our biggest challenge still remains planning, actually, generally, in terms of getting projects through the system, the amount of consultants we now need on board, the expense of getting things through. But probably more challenging is the time of getting things through. So I won't say more on that, Matthew, because I know we're going to come on to planning a bit later. But that certainly is our biggest challenge at the moment.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thanks for that, Andy. Great. If you could turn off your camera, and we'll now come to my guest on my right, which is Charlie. So Charlie, we had some big technology issues, but Charlie very carefully sort of avoided that and came straight to us here at Bicester Motion, where we're based at the moment for this interview, and is now sitting alongside me. So, Charlie, your role at Savills, and also a quick overview of what's the big issue for use in the industrial market, and then we'll go into a bit of market commentary.
Sure. Thanks, Matthew. And hopefully on my journey up here, I also avoided not only the technical issues, but also speed cameras as well. So I'm Charles Rotonlee. For those of you who don't know me, I head up the commercial agency team at Savills in Oxford and sort of cover the whole of the Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and area parts of Berkshire market. Matthew was asked if I can just do a sort of a brief piece on our marketplace, on the greater Oxfordshire marketplace, because I think it would be fair to say that the title of this section, Industrial Revolution, is particularly apt for us, because I believe we are going through exactly that at the moment. So where do we start? Let's put this into context. Historically, I would suggest that the Oxfordshire market has been involved in manufacturing of car parts and of cars. The Morris factory in Oxford, there was an awful lot of manufacturing taking place to supply that and other factories in the area. This has progressed further forward, and whilst we still do have a very active car production system with BMW Mini, with Jaguar Land Rover, and countless Formula One teams, racing teams, and all of the infrastructure that supports that. The market has also moved on. So I think it would be fair to say that the M40 corridor is an underutilized motorway, and it's seen by a lot. It's giving very good access from Andy's marketplace in the Thames Valley and the M25 through up to Birmingham, the Midlands, and beyond as well. And this is brought in with the A34 dual carriageway down to the M3 and the M27, very good access to Southampton, the ports, and the rest of the UK. So what are we seeing in the greater area? One area of development and demand we're seeing is warehousing, big demand for warehousing of all sizes, so mid-size and big box. And that's being let at the moment to last mile distributors, and probably more importantly to supermarkets and food distributors as well, because whilst I think it was inevitable that we would have seen a greater online purchasing trend, I think the lockdown that we've been in has condensed that down, but we'll speak about that more later. I think the other very exciting area which we're seeing growth in is science and technology, and certainly those of you who do know me and know the market, I can talk for hours on this subject, which I won't do now. But we are seeing crinkly tin R&D buildings and science sheds coming up, and these are proving particularly attractive to the science and the tech sectors who don't necessarily require office-style laboratory buildings, but are looking for a facility that is slightly more flexible. They can put mezzanine floors in, they can have loading doors, and they can do more research and development, but also manufacturing as well. The designs are structurally not dissimilar, but there seems to be more design flair going into the actual building and the cladding itself. I'm very happy to talk about that as we progress with planning as well. We're seeing a lot of development taking place down in Didcot at Milton Park, Didcot Quarter, across the road at Harwell, and I think we'll see more development taking place in Kidlington, Oxford Ring Road, and further north in Bicester, Cemetery Park, etc., etc. So that's really a quick insight into what's going on, Matthew.
Okay, that's
set the scene.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think as much as you talk about Oxfordshire or Greater Oxfordshire, as you say, I think some of these issues do actually cover across the region. And perhaps Andy and Paul, you could turn on your screens now, and we could have a chat. Not quite around a fireplace, but you know what I mean. So I suppose first question is, Charlie's sort of given an image, or sorry, described a very busy market, a very, what I would call a hot market. Would you agree with that, Andy? Would you agree with Charlie's sentiment?
Yeah, I think I would. And Paul touched on demand. I think you ally that with a lack of supply in the area. That's really why we've got the market that we have. In our particular patch, employment land is very scarce, so opportunities to develop are generally existing industrial or warehousing complexes, as opposed to land that might be allocated for employment use. In my experience, and where it is allocated for employment use, it's generally actually quite small plots, part of residential schemes. Quite often, to be honest with you, as a developer, and Paul probably agrees, you probably wouldn't want to be developing employment space in that area in the first place. You prefer to be on a main road or close to some sort of major motorway junction. So yes, I would agree. And I think the biggest challenge for me in working with local authorities or planners is the whole description of employment. I think if you speak to planners about employment, they seem to always defer back to office space as employment generation. they don't tend to discriminate between the different classes of employment, which we all know within a use classes order. So inevitably, when you talk about creating employment space for the vast amount of housing that's coming through the system in the area, it's generally, I was going to say generally town centre, but also clearly also adds town areas like Green Park in Reading, where the plans are referring to generating employment space. So the biggest challenge really is getting a message over that, if you're allocating thousands of units of housing in our patch in the Thames Valley, you should also be allocating appropriate employment land that is generally deliverable in the right locations.
Okay, that's very interesting, and we'll come back to some of the planning issues in a minute. And we got quite an interesting comment from Alistair Corey about, I guess, really the ambition of planning and whether it. But we'll come back in a minute, I think, and explore that. Paul, what's your view? You probably agree with Charlie, wouldn't you? It sounds like you've also experiencing a hot market.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with what Charlie said, and I agree with what Andy said as well. I mean, I think for the industrial market, what you were seeing was, leading up to 2020, was some real structural trends that were driving the market. The move towards e-commerce in particular, we'd been seeing impacting the market for quite a while. Of course, what's happened this year with the pandemic is it's just amplified those sort of trends. So, if you look in the UK, I think e-commerce was about 19% of retailing in 2019. We're now talking about 24-25% for 2020. So you've sort of made 5 years progress probably in 5 months. So all those issues that Andy was talking about with lack of allocated land was a problem before, and has just been amplified now by the rapid change in the market.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. I suppose that there is an elephant in the room, which is this growth of e-retailing, as you say, to 25%. And you make a very good point about the way it's concertina demand, and we're now at this sort of tipping point, which I think is very interesting. And the elephant in the room for me is the threat to the retail high street. Do you think we just have moved into a different conversation now? Do you think the use of buying through the internet now is actually moved to a different phase? I mean, what's the feedback you're getting from your?
Yeah, I think undoubtedly. I think one would expect that probably the levels of internet buying will drop a bit as hopefully we come out of the pandemic. But I think the step change has really been made. And again, even pre-COVID, I think you were seeing that the high street was having to change. If you see some of the plans that are coming forward for some of the town centre redevelopments, if you look at what British Land are looking to do in Slough, for instance, it's very much not a traditional high street anymore. They're looking to make a very different offer. And that retailing's now been picked up greatly online. And so to Andy's point in terms of around allocation of employment land, the employment land, yes, it's providing employment, but it's actually also servicing the needs of the residential units. We've all got to know our local Amazon delivery, Hermes delivery man over the last few months pretty well.
Okay, that's very
the same thing, actually. I think I must have an Amazon delivery in my house almost every day, actually thinking about it. I think that seems to be the way forward. I tell a story actually when I was at home and I needed to buy something from a very well-known electrical out-of-town retailer. And I thought, well, I'll go there, and actually maybe I'll buy a few other bits that I need for my computer at home, including printer and a few other bits. And having gone in there to find what I wanted, it wasn't there. I approached the person who was helping and said, well, I'm looking at this and this, and said, oh, you can go online here and order, and it'll come to your house. Now, what I'm trying to say there is that retailers need to think about what they're doing as well. If they want to encourage people into their stores, then they need to offer the wide range of goods that you come in for. Otherwise, we're just going to order online, and they lose that, how can I put it, wandering shopper that actually might pick up other goods when they come in. So it's more about the experience of actually getting people into the units. And then, taking Paul's point, I think another great example is Maidenhead Town Centre in our area, where I can't remember who bought the Nicholson Shopping Centre for, can you? But they're doing something similar. So shopping centre goes, you're looking at a much more dense scheme, I hasten to add. And many shopping centres are only 2-storey, 3-storey at best. So the scheme there that I've seen in draft is 4 or 5 major blocks, 12 to 16 stories, with offices and residential above, and a very much reduced prime retail footprint. And I think that's what we're going to see in town centres and cities, a very much reduced prime retail area, but maybe more of a core, actually, that is kept prime retail, so it's very focused. And then those outer line areas are going to be bringing in, dare I say, offices, student housing. I would have said hotels, but that's a challenging market now as well. And perhaps the opportunity to bring in care into town and city centres as well. So there's a major structural change going forward.
Okay, that's very interesting. And again, raises a couple of issues which we'll come back to. Charlie just wants to have a quick update.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, Andy, I'm sure the electrical retailer you went to was the same one I went to in Oxford a few months ago as well, and had exactly the same experience there. I went in to buy some supplies for my computer at home and was told that it was cheaper and there was a greater range if I went online, so I left the store empty-handed. And I can't see that is the encouragement that retailers should be given to people who want to go and buy product from their unit. What I was going to say was that, whilst we see enormous demand in companies looking for that last mile unit to deliver to the home, what I think we are also seeing is further demand as well from companies who are taking the returns back from the deliveries. And we're hearing all sorts of things about buying clothes in 4 or 5 sizes because one size doesn't fit all. Those products have to be sent back, and on Friday, for instance, we're out with an internet company who we acquired some big units for last year. They need another big unit this year to handle the quantity of returns that they receive from their people.
Okay, that's very helpful. Just to explore that issue of the last mile and to drill down a bit with that, do people, Paul and Andy, do you see that as changing? What do you see as the last mile? Are we moving more towards drones and that sort of technology? Where do you think technology is going to take us on the last mile? And maybe you could just explain exactly what we mean by last mile as well, just for the uninitiated. Paul?
Yeah, sure. Well, last mile very much is those guys you see turn up at your door with the parcel from Hermes, from DHL, from Amazon, from whoever. So that parcel will have gone on its journey from wherever it was manufactured, probably through a couple of distribution centres, ended up with a distribution centre probably in the Midlands in the UK, and then distributed out to a local parcel delivery centre, probably is the right way of putting it. And of course, in terms of locations, those are very much going to follow heads of population. It's super interesting to talk to some of these delivery guys. Lots of them are only delivering to half a dozen streets in the town, and that's enough to keep them busy. So, the density has really gone up. And with the increase in residential development, we now need to be able to service that from delivery centres.
I mean, it's an interesting one. It's funny you say about delivery. A chap delivered a post about 8 o'clock to us the other night, and I said, "Oh, you're working late." And on the box, it had 167 on it. He had done 167 deliveries that day.
Really?
Yeah. And it's just incredible. In his van, and he was off to bed to do it all again tomorrow, I assume. So it shows what's going on out there, the kind of energy. So I suppose what I'm trying to find out is what's the next generation of last mile delivery? Where are we going to on this, do you think?
I think it's no more complicated than you have to follow the chimney pots, to be perfectly honest. These guys are trying to service the major centres of population. So follow the population growth, you will follow the growth in last mile delivery.
Well, I guess taking that one step further, going back to my comments about employment land being on residential estates, I mean, maybe, if you're looking at bigger urban areas, that you should be allowing for last mile distribution within that planning process. If you've got thousands of units being built, maybe you include that sort of opportunity in the whole process.
I definitely think that's the message we need to start to get across to government and the planners, that when you're looking at major residential development, you need to think about the industrial last mile delivery elements that are needed to service that.
I think that's right. And in 2018, I think it was the British Property Federation did a survey, and they showed that each household supported 69 square feet of distribution space. So for every household, we needed 70 square feet of warehouse for last mile delivery. So that will, absolutely right, the requirement will continue to grow as housing grows. If we're looking at numbers like 1 million houses in the Oxford-Cambridge arc, that's essentially saying we need 69, 70 million square foot of warehousing to supply.
Yeah, it's big numbers. I mean, it's interesting thought, and a couple of these roads of discussion seem to be travelling towards planning and getting the message across to planners. I know there's something we've spoken about in the past, Andy. How do we up that sort of conversation? And are planners receptive to that, or are the needs of housing greater? What's your thoughts?
Well, yeah, a few points you raised there. I think my experience of planning is that it's reactive rather than proactive. Now, a great example right now is that we have planning applications in for mixed-use schemes in town and city centres, where the planners are still insisting on retail on the ground floor whilst they've got empty units around us. Does not make any sense at all. Yeah. We all know what's happening to the retail market. We all know we're going online. We all know town and city centres are changing. But try and get that message over to planning authorities is very, very, very hard. And maybe we need some sort of impetus like we have with the housing market. Maybe this boils down to the government actually giving local authorities targets for employment generation. I think it's probably going to be the only way of doing it, and being penalised if you don't do it. Actually, I know what you feel, Paul, but actually, no, you're lucky because you have an SPZ, don't you? So you've got flexibility in terms of providing space. I sort of welcome the initiatives coming out of the white paper at the moment. I think if we go back to the old zoning days, where you've got implied permission for certain types of uses, which really at the moment is designed for the housing sector, but actually, if we can tag on employment sectors, that would be a massive result for us, I think.
Yeah,
I completely agree. I think that's where the pressure needs to go, Andy. Clearly, a lot of the movement in terms of planning at the moment is very housing centric, residential centric. But if we can get a focus onto employment land in the same vein, I think it could be very positive. I mean, the move is to simplify and speed up the system, and that has to be a good thing. But it just can't all be focused on residential.
Okay.
And actually, the simplified planning zone we have on the Slough Trading Estate, which for people who don't know what it is, it's a 10-year agreement we have with Slough Borough Council, which means we can develop logistics, industrial, data centres and research and development buildings within certain parameters, effectively with a deemed planning consent, has proved, we're in our third iteration of that now. And it's proved to be really successful in delivering space into Slough and helping to grow the economy in Slough.
Yeah, okay, that's quite interesting.
Just add something else there as well, because we're talking about larger industrial and distribution space here. What are we doing about startups and small businesses? I mean, dare I say, I remember the time when, showing my age now, that local authorities used to build their own little units to encourage startups in various areas. I don't see any small units being built these days. I mean, do we need local authorities to get back in there to try and encourage startups and have build their own buildings, or have some sort of grants or tax incentives to provide space for smaller occupiers?
Yeah, it's interesting on the planning situation. We were involved in a planning application recently for a scheme near Oxford, which was going to be small industrial units. And one of the concerns that the council had was that they would be converted into residential units and not kept as commercial. And we agreed that we would keep them as commercial, and they could put that into the planning application.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's not just big sheds. You're absolutely right. We see enormous demand from the sort of 2,000 and 3,000 square foot occupiers, for the small businesses spinning out of the university, starting up their own businesses, and moving right the way through the side range up into the sort of mid-20s, 30s, 40s.
I mean, that's quite an interesting point about the SMEs as well. Paul, you mentioned, I think your stat was 76% increase in demand, and in particular from the SMEs. Again, just to give a bit of definition, what sort of companies are these when you say SMEs, and how are they using the space?
Yeah, I think that's been interesting. So one of the strengths of the Slough Trading Estate is the diversity of occupiers there. And so we've seen demand from a range of sectors, but I suppose the one that has stood out has been e-commerce companies. So they're very small guys who are trading online through platforms like Amazon and eBay, and are taking that step into establishing their first small warehousing.
Okay, yeah, fascinating, and I think that's a huge area. I think just a question here, a couple of questions from the chat. What is the panel's view on the future and life cycle of B8 sheds with changing technology, drone technology, for example? Will the locations adjacent to a key highway junction still be key? Andy, do you have any view on that?
I don't think that changes. I think you've still got to get whatever product that you are distributing to the warehouse in the first place, and that will still happen by roads at the end of the day, won't it? So proximity to major motorways and major junctions won't change in my view.
Yeah,
Completely agree.
completely agree.
But even though connectivity, the word connectivity is changing a bit more. I mean, the session we had this morning with Elliot at Stantec, we just talked about this issue of connecting, and one of the issues around the ARC, for example, as we're talking about the ARC and the schemes to the north of London, if you like, is how new settlements get connected. I mean, industrial, is it really reliant still very much on motorways, or are there different ways it can be resolved?
Heavily reliant still on motorways, but you are seeing alternative means of distributing that bulk coming through. So outside of the area geographically that we're talking about, but SEGRO developed several rail freight interchanges. We've opened one in the last year at our East Midlands Gateway scheme, which has proved to be very successful. I think you are seeing some rail transport, and there are examples on the continent of people using canals and rivers more for that bulk transport. But still, the vast majority is going to come by road.
Andy, do any of your schemes, or what's your view with that? Do you have any examples of alternative methods, or is it still very much road?
No, I think it's very
alternative, really, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I don't see it changing that much. I agree with Paul. Rail, yes, but how else are we going to get bulk into the warehousing unless you're close to ports, airports, etc.? I don't see a different way of doing it personally.
Yeah, I agree with both. It is very difficult to get rail infrastructure changed, to get railheads onto main lines, and to interfere with what are already busy timetables for commuters and passenger transport.
Okay, because I can see that subject growing as we go forward. I put up a poll which is about what is the property solution for the industrial sector, and this was kind of trying to have a chat about types of building, and I put down double deck structures, dig deep basements, release more land, or use foreign lands for data storage. Now, just to explain the last one, because I've got no responses on that, so there's probably general confusion about that. So what I mean by that is, for example, data centers, just talking about data centers, I believe in the Nordic countries, they build data centers and they put all the cloud storage and the data storage. One of the reasons they do it there is because they use the cool water to provide cooling. So the hot energy or the energy is used to create the data is then cooled naturally using water from the North Sea. There we go. And I'm just wondering whether we can see more clever, smarter ways for us to grow our industrial, which perhaps is ironically not in this country. Perhaps it's a bigger picture. Perhaps I'm getting carried away myself. But anyway, just to talk about types of building, obviously land is at a premium. That's demand is high. This seems to me like a perfect economics story about supply and demand here. And there's a danger the industrial market could price itself out. How do you see that being resolved, Paul, in terms of looking at structures and the building types?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of ways you'll see it resolved. I mean, SEGRO are doing a lot of work in terms of multi-level industrial. So we've undertaken a double-deck scheme in Paris called Air 2, which has been very successful. And I think initially you will see those multi-level industrial schemes in the major conurbations. So in the UK, it will be London first, undoubtedly. I'm not sure the Thames Valley is completely ready for it yet, but probably follows on number 2 or 3 location after inside the M25. I think you're seeing a number of schemes starting to come forward within the M25. In terms of data centres, we're already there. We're building 3- and 4-storey data centres on the Slough Trading Estate already, so managing to get more out of the scarce land availability. And there are plenty of examples. If you go to Amsterdam, the Equinix AM4 data centre is 12 stories there. So you can undoubtedly see that there's a direction of travel for both industrial and data centres in terms of going up, increased height. I think that can be for the industrial, both logistics, but actually maybe for some of those SMEs as well. There's a sort of flatted factory type solution that people are starting to look at for those as well.
And even though arguably I'm not sure the comparison between data center rental and other industrial, whether it's higher or lower, I assume it's lower, but that industrial, that data center is still a healthy market in places like Slough. I would have thought West London, it doesn't really make sense, but I guess in Slough it probably does, and the further out you go.
Undoubtedly, Slough is not just the UK, but Europe's sort of epicenter for data centres. But there's a very healthy market in West and North London as well. Generally, it will drive higher values than industrial. And again, we've just seen a massive spike in demand for data centres. We're all doing so much more online. We've got this webinar running online. And there's a data center somewhere humming away, which is making this all happen for us. All of those e-commerce trades, the amount of demand there was for Netflix, Amazon Video during lockdown, the amount of social media that's going on is all driving demand for those data centers. So we are seeing a great uptick in demand for data centers. I think that the stat from OpenReach was in the UK, data traffic went up 24%. Over the sort of lockdown period in the UK. And again, that's much like e-commerce, you'll see that come back slightly, but there's been a step change which won't be reversed. So we're still seeing continued very strong demand for data centres. I think there's a stat out in the EG of about 2.25 million square feet of planning applications for data centres went in during the lockdown period.
Okay, that's and the other point, just finally on that, Paul, about basements, is that going down? Is that just too expensive? Digging into
it is expensive. Again, I think you will see schemes like that come forward in the most prime of locations. So central London in the UK, undoubtedly. Potentially there are schemes like that in places like Paris and London. Out in the Thames Valley, I don't think the economics yet work.
Yeah, interesting, Andy. Just looking at the poll, I mean, some people are saying about releasing more land, but of course, around the Thames Valley, that's a motive, and as we know, it's difficult. I know. Yeah. Anyway, you're at the forefront of some of these issues, especially with planners. What's your thoughts about looking at different structures and different types of building?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of thoughts actually. I think two-story warehousing and industrial has always been a bit of a challenge in West London and Thames Valley. Why? Perception, I guess, more than anything else. It's getting occupiers to buy into it, but also we're all driven by the investment market as well. Actually, unfortunately, so as a trader developer, I'm always looking at exits. Could I exit a two-story shed? Maybe, but it's a big risk to take. Existing investors have got portfolios. Yes, if you're looking at rental income and improving returns, I can see it. Second point really is, can we look at mixed use now with a bit of smaller industrial or warehousing below it in some of the urban areas? I know there is that intransigence between residential on the uppers and perceived production. But if that can be managed somehow in terms of restricting the type of occupiers that goes in, maybe that's something we can look at, and people are looking at it as well going forward. Otherwise, it's management of brownfield land, in my view. Certainly in the Thames Valley, there's lots of examples of pockets of smaller old industrial in residential areas. I think of many in Wickham, for instance, where we've had the old furniture industry that really should be going to residential because it's 100% surrounded by residential. But it's protected by local authorities. So maybe we can manage that process and say, okay, we'll release those pockets of older brownfield, but actually let's allocate a bit of land close to the motorway where we're encouraging new development. I think you just need a sensible thought process going forward.
Okay, that's figured. Trying to add anything to that, looking at different types of building, is there a market for it, or is it?
Yeah, I think the true double-decker buildings are going to be very much governed by land values and rental levels, but we are seeing it to a certain extent in a lot of new building that's being built where to future-proof the buildings so that if people don't need the volume but the floor plate for picking or whatever, they're certainly putting pads and enhanced foundations in to take mezzanine floors, so there can be multi-floors within existing buildings.
Okay, interesting. And fun enough, we've got a couple of questions here about the sustainability of the buildings and just looking at the need to have certainly look at having recycled sources. Jim was talking about solar paneling, and just because they are, I think this will become more relevant. Has the government got a parallel plan for energy capacity and continuity for data centers? So that sustainability issue, is that something when you're designing your new buildings, Paul? Does that all come into it? And because obviously there's a huge energy and also use of materials which are expensive, not only to the environment but also in cost.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's changed massively just very recently. If you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have said for the largest warehouses and sheds we're building, then yes, sustainability is an issue because you're dealing with that sort of corporate customer base. But for your average SME, it's not really an issue. I think now that has changed. The sort of awareness of those sustainability issues is now very prevalent in the market. And so we are seeing a push towards more renewable energy, around recycling materials, just really simple things. I was on one of our sites about a year ago, And actually, the site manager had found reusable ducts that could be put in the ground for the telecommunications cables and that sort of stuff. So it's really just simple things, but are starting to become really important to your industrial occupiers. There's then a big issue around data centers. Clearly, they use a massive amount of energy. And much as we're talking about changing planners' perceptions, I think the data center industry needs to have a very large conversation with itself and all of its stakeholders around energy use. Actually, there was a study done by the International Energy Research Center in June this year, which showed that whilst over the last 10 years, the amount of data that's transmitted around the world has gone up tenfold and the workload for our data centers has gone up sevenfold, actually data centers are still only using about 1% of global energy, which is the same as 10 years ago. Now that's come through increased efficiency as we're moving towards cloud computing, which is a much more efficient way of doing the computing that we all need to be able to do the social networking, all our business systems which have moved into the cloud, etc. So actually, there is a really positive environmental story around data centers. And you put on top of that, that actually the operators of data centers, your likes of your Equinixes and your CyrusOnes, will commission renewable energy. And then if you look at the big users of data centers, the hyperscale cloud guys, people like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, they are the biggest users of renewable energy anywhere in the world. So I think last year, Google was the #1 off-taker of renewable energy globally. So there is a sort of positive story there.
Okay, yeah, no, that's very helpful. And again, just looking at some of the questions here, interestingly, Steve Dixon mentions about the cooling, and actually that the design now has moved on, in that suppliers want their data centers to be closer to their users to ensure connectivity, which I can kind of understand, and it minimizes data transfer time, which is interesting. So thank you, Steve, for that out there. And Jim has asked a question. He says we've answered it, but I'm not sure we have actually. What about industrial co-location, living and communities alongside and above sheds? Well, there's a thought.
Sort of what I was saying, really, actually. Yeah, when I was thinking about it, when I go back to my agency days, working in West London, I'm thinking about Hayes here particularly. There was always a multi-story building on Blythe Road. Must have been 7 or 8 stories high, like an old textile mill. I don't know if it's still there now, actually. But when I was an agent, I mean, that was served by, crikey, it must have been built in the 1930s. But that was served by a very big goods lift. And we're always finding that we're letting those floors quite easily, interestingly enough. Generally, I guess, more around the Asian textile community. But that functioned quite well. I mean, maybe that's the sort of thing we could be thinking about going forward. So you don't have big floor-to-ceiling heights, probably bigger than the average office floor-to-ceiling height. And probably got smaller businesses in there as well. But I mean, that's certainly going back to the utilization of land point of view, and that's an urban location, just by Hayes Town Centre. Maybe in those denser urban areas, that's something that could be considered. I don't know, Paul, do you remember that building in Hayes I'm talking about? I can't remember what it's called now, but
I don't remember the building, but certainly the concept is something that we're looking at. So it's that sort of clustering of small units. And rather than putting them in the horizontal, you start to put them in the vertical. Yeah. And when you start to think about it, there's a lot you can do. It'll undoubtedly improve security for those occupiers. You can put in some sort of central amenity around meeting rooms and coffee offer and those sort of things. And actually, it becomes some quite appealing space if people can get around the idea of not having their own dedicated delivery point and having to use central lifts, etc. But most of our SMEs actually aren't having loads of deliveries day after day after day when you start to look at it. I think it's a very interesting concept.
Yeah,
You're also looking at floor loading, though, I guess,
Yep.
depending on the type of business you're going to encourage in there. I mean, it's quite expensive, going up several floors, but I could see it working, actually.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Charlie, what's your view on that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, in the Oxford area, we're looking at exactly that sort of use in multi-story buildings, because not everybody is creating large volumes and heavy product. A lot of it is small, almost desk-based tech that they're working on. And I think going back, there was a similar building I remember in Maidenhead many years ago on Moorbridge Road somewhere, where they had a multi-story building there, and that would function very well. I can see us returning to that sort of design. Actually, I think it'd be pretty cool as well.
Yeah, and just to become full circles, we talked, sort of the last 5-10 minutes we've got. Is that a potential use or reinvigoration of the high street, do you think? I mean, Andy, you talked about having a core within the high street, which has got an interesting concept, and then you'd have peripheral areas around the outside which fed into I guess the makeup of a town, if you like. But could this concept, which people are working on and looking at, could this fit within the core?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's not one I've sort of really thought about. It also begs the question at the moment, where is that office market heading as well? In terms of requirements from occupiers, are they downsizing? Are they moving out of town slightly? But I can certainly see it in the more secondary office market, slightly outside the prime core area, where it's an interesting angle. Converting some of those office buildings. Okay, most of them wouldn't have the appropriate lift in place from a goods point of view, but in those prime urban areas, some of the rents one's now achieving on smaller industrials are certainly well into the double figures, and will be, interesting enough, competing with office rents, actually. So that's a really good point, and something that might be worth thinking about, which I hadn't thought about in terms of alternative uses.
I think it's definitely an opportunity, and we're looking at a number of large department stores at the moment where we're looking at repurposing them for other commercial uses. They do tend to have big floor plates. That a lot of them have very good slab to slab heights as well. So putting the infrastructure in it's not easy, but it's not that difficult. And we're looking at 3 or 4 at the moment where we'll be putting alternative uses into the high street, so right in the retail core.
That's interesting. And I think coming back on some of the comments here from Tim, I had a career in Asia. Multi-story industrial buildings are very familiar in Asia. It's a lot about perception. That's interesting. And I suppose about the design and how that is sold, if that's the right word, to the marketplace. But I think that's quite an interesting comment. Also, Richard, the mix of HGVs and residential use a potential issue. It certainly is. But the concept is important to consider, and he's involved in a scheme with 1,000 dwellings and 1 million of B8. There we go. That's interesting as well. So it's stuff's happening out there. And I think the final one from Kevin, I think, Andy, you may be referring to the shipping building. Does that ring a bell in Hayes?
No.
The building in Hayes, which now have a mix of office accommodation. I'm not sure. I think the building, wasn't it the EMI building in Hayes? There was the EMI in Hayes.
It was an old one. I think they moved out of it, actually. So it's opposite the new complex. Is it Clayton? Yeah.
You and I bought the scheme there, didn't they? Anyway.
They did. Yeah.
Okay, so that's quite interesting. Again, I just wanted to come back to I don't mean to sort of skew the conversation with the retail discussion or the high street, but it sounds as if, interestingly, which I hadn't thought about, is this different uses. Actually, there's an opportunity here within the high street for this slightly different type of industrial tenant, which we're talking about. And as you say, it's all about e-commerce, which is very, very relevant. As we come into the final leg, is there anything, because I think the one person which I forgot to mention in the beginning, unfortunately, again, due to technical issues, Kim Cohen from Barton Wilmore couldn't join us, and we do miss her because she was going to be talking about the planning issues, and she's talking to planners quite a lot, and she will have or does have some very good feedback on that. However, what we're going to do, I'm going to interview her separately and probably in her offices at Barton Wilmore. We will then stream that and get feedback from her and use that as a sort of separate feed, and we'll send that to everybody. So again, apologies to Kim and Barton Wilmore. We had a similar issue with Neil yesterday. There we go. They've obviously got some fantastic IT people at Barton Wilmore, so we will try and resolve that and get that information to you. So coming into the final sort of 3 or 4 minutes, do you want to kind of wrap up really? Paul, do you want to just sort of, what's your view looking ahead, I suppose, and just taking a view just to be visionary? Where do you see, you know, if we had this chat in 5 years' time, it's interesting you said how the last 5 months has concertinaed everything. What's the next 5 years going to do?
I suppose in wrapping up, there's two things I would say, and I will come to your sort of long-term point. I think in the short term, I think we've all been very positive. I think we do have to recognise that within our customer base at the moment, there's been a variety of impacts from the COVID pandemic. A lot of our customers have done very well out of it, and actually their challenges are around meeting the increased demand. But there are others, particularly those related to the airline sectors, to the hospitality sectors, those, you know, providing wholesale foods into the hospitality sectors, etc., who are finding life very difficult at the moment. So I think there's a short-term bit around continuing to support those customers. I think the long-term visionary bit is undoubtedly around intensification of use. So I think in 5 years' time, we will be seeing multi-level schemes outside of London, and undoubtedly those will be built with sustainability right at the heart of them. So I think intensification and sustainability are the two big themes that I would see coming forward over that sort of 5 to 10 year time frame.
Okay, that's very good. And Andy, what about you?
I would add 2 words to Paul's, which would be flexibility and, dare I say, ingenuity or lateral thinking. We've all been involved in our sort of specialist sectors over the years, and my experience of sectors is that people sort of quite narrow-minded in their sectors. I think we need to think outside our box, think about alternative uses, think about emerging markets. Charlie's point about department stores just reminded me about 2 department stores that are going to offices at the moment. One is Wickham, the old House of Fraser there. So thinking about converting the floors there into offices. And then there's a Westfield in Shepherd's Bush doing the same. And what that does is actually just brings people back in to the shopping centre, doing different times a day, maybe as well. So it's flexibility and lateral thinking, I suppose, for the next few years.
Okay, Charlie.
I would agree and won't repeat that, but I think the other area in warehousing, which we have been talking about, and heavy goods vehicles coming in and out of distribution hubs, I think it'll be very interesting to see how vehicle technology changes over the next 5 years. The introduction of electric lorries, electric vans, and that sort of tech, which will be more user friendly, particularly when you've got a guy doing 100 deliveries in 2 or 3 streets of a town or city, which is commonplace all over the UK.
Okay, that's very, very helpful, and thank you to everybody for today for helping out and being part of this really fascinating seminar. I didn't think it would kind of go where we would go, so that was really good. Actually, really interesting to see what's going on out there. And I think some of the things I'm taking away from this are this issue, because land is not increasing, land is reducing in its availability and the pressures we have. But I do think the intensification discussion is really relevant, and that will have many manifestations, whether up or down or across or whatever. And I think also from a local plan, and we'll get more feedback from Kim in due course, but I think the local plan is key, and I agree with Andy. We've got to keep pushing that theming, and maybe the zoning discussion could work in favour in terms of employment land, but we've got to keep waving that flag, because I do worry it gets lost in the resi discussion all the time. And I'm not saying that is a good or bad thing, but people need to realise seems to me a broader discussion here. So, and I think finally, which all of everybody's talked about, and it comes up all the time, is this idea of smart tech and where smart tech is going to take us, and none of us know. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? You know, as Paul said, is 25% buying online at the moment. I don't know what it will be after in so many years. It's going to increase. So on that note, thank you very much. We've got one more session in an hour's time. Again, apologies for not having Kim with us. We'll try and resolve that. We'll send you the link. Thank you to our guests, to Paul, Andy, and for Charlie, who came here in person. And we will talk again if you're going to join us in 2 hours' time. But if not, thank you very much, and we'll see you all soon.